I would like to introduce Steve Yanish, who will be telling the story of Martin Schlenk. Steve is not a family member of Martin's, but he was a neighbor and a good friend of Martin's and the Schlenk family for several years. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Nancy. As Nancy said, Martin Schlenk was, he wasn't Martin Schlenk, he was Mr. Schlenk to me. And his wife lived across the street from me and my family. I was going to say welcome to Mark Schlenk. I thought Mark was going to be here, but we do have Mark Schlenk here. He's in the back, and we have two of his sisters are here. Darlene is here, as well as Mary. So we have three Schlenks here. Where's Darlene? All right. Well, I was going to tell a story about Mark. So when I was in grade school, you'd go out to play. Maybe 8th grade, you'd have a 22 and you want to walk down the tracks. My mom would say, well, who's going with you? And I'd say, well, Tom Pauley maybe. And she said, well, who else? If I said Mark Schlenk, it was golden, and then I was good. So Mark, if I ever mentioned your name, it was golden in my house. 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Martin, at the age of 37, married with 5 kids, was drafted into the Navy. He probably could have asked for deferment with 5 kids, but he didn't. He wanted to serve his country. In the Navy, he was a boilerman or worked in, quote, the fire room. He worked on a ship called the USS Bunker Hill. I think we have a picture of it. It was an aircraft carrier, about 870 feet long, or about 3 times the length of the Viking Stadium. The crew on that ship was about 2,600 Navy men. It held between 90 and 100 planes. It distinguished itself on 2 accounts for sure. It fought in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and it fought in the invasion of Okinawa. 70 years ago, on a Friday morning, the Japanese attacked this ship, and I'm going to read from you 2 entries from Martin's diary. The first one is on May 11th, 1945. It's Friday morning, 10 o'clock, and I'll read you what Martin wrote. May 11th, 1945 entry. Had general quarters at 9:13 a.m. Secured and set condition 1 easy at 10:13. I was in my rack when I heard the explosion and heard someone say that calls for a GQ, so started from my battle station, which was in number 1 fire room of the boiler room. Started to run, and by the time I was halfway down, the second one hit us. They were suicide planes with bombs. Was in the fire room about 5 minutes when smoke started coming out of the blowers. We put on gas masks. The smoke got so thick you couldn't see an inch from your nose. We tried to secure the boilers but couldn't see and prepared to abandon the fire room, but we couldn't get the hatches open and knew we were trapped like rats until someone opened them from above. We had 19 men in the fire room, of which 8 men died of suffocation, burns, and falls. Machinist mate Beach, Allen First Class, and lots of others tried to escape, but only died trying. Finally, we sat down and just waited. Finally, the smoke cleared some, and you could see fellows lying all around you. You didn't know if the men were dead or alive. We opened the door of the escape hatch, and water came running in. So we thought we were going to sink. There are 3 of us sitting up now, and figured if we were going to die, we would have one last smoke. So after the smoke, we looked around and then saw the rescue party coming down. He said, I made it up on my own power, but after they gave me a drink of water, I passed out and woke up on the deck covered with blankets. Got sick as the devil and vomited 5 times. Then they gave me into an officer's bunk where I slept until morning. My eyes hurt pretty badly. They treated them. Then I went and cleaned up. I didn't know myself. My face and my head were so black. I thought I could easily have gotten a job in the wardroom waiting on tables. You can tell things were different back then. Some officers gave me some of his clothes to wear, and I went out on the deck to see the damage. Our planes had just started to take off, and the Japs crashed into our ship. The heat was so terrible on the hangar deck, it melted 4 inches of armor plating. There were about 10,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammo that exploded. On May 12th, which was the next day, we had burial service for 373 of our shipmates. Bodies were found for days after in places hard to get. One electrician was electrocuted on May 13th, 2 days later, working on his line. We had about 1,000 casualties in all. It was a very sad day for the Bunker Hill. Most bodies were burned beyond recognition, and a roster was taken. We lost 42% of the men in the fire room. The planes on the hangar and flight decks exploded. The number 2 elevation nearly blew off the ship. The number 3 elevation was totally melted down. It looked like, and I can't read this where it's covered up, but something hanging down. The boys on the guns on the port side were all burned at their guns. Only skeletons and shoes on them remained. Admiral Mitchen and his staff were transferred to the USS Enterprise. That day we only had one meal, and that was breakfast. The smell of death is all over the place, and it isn't very pleasant. Admiral Mitchen estimated the damages at $30 million. The number 1 fire room where he worked was completely ruined. He thinks the temperatures at the times must have gotten to 200 degrees. Today he says, I thank God I'm lucky enough to be alive. And not in the deep blue. The next day, May 12th, he writes a shorter entry, says, this is the day after the attack. We buried our dead men. 373 were over the side, 2 more, 15 more next day. 151 missing, 305 went over the side, but most of them were picked up. About 1,000 casualties, or a third of our crew. We're still finding bodies. We are on our way to Ulythia. Ulythia is a small little island with about 1,000 people on it. 1957, 12 years later, at the end of the war, Martin watched my family of 7 pile out of our car and move into our house across the street. And how do I know he was watching? Because every day, Martin sat at the same table, the same cup of coffee, by the same window, and watched Chanhassen go by. So I definitely know he watched us go by. I knew Mr. Schlenk was in the Navy, but that's all I really knew. My biggest memory was in the day Chanhassen, there was memorial service for Memorial Day, and Mr. Schlenk, my dad, and others would try to put on their old uniforms that couldn't button them. And they would go out into the Chanhassen Cemetery with their rifles and do a salute, and they'd shoot. And all the kids, we'd run out in the grass to get the shells because we could blow in those and make whistles. There's one last tidbit about Martin and a fellow that was with him on the USS ship he was on. Maybe they had a smoke together, maybe they had breakfast together. The fellow that was on the ship with him was Paul Newman. So, Nancy, I thank you for putting this on, and Tom Pauling, it is a great pleasure. I learned a lot doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I will say one of the most powerful and moving experiences I've ever had was the opportunity to read Martin Schlenk's diary. And much of Steve's information came from Martin's diary, and I'm grateful that his family allowed us to take a peek at it. I'm certainly grateful that he wrote it. It just feels like even more powerful than reading this event, this attack on the Bunker Hill, you can find it all over the internet. There's videos, stories, history books, but nobody tells it like Martin Schlenk and his diary. So thank you very much for that. Now we will have, always have to be careful I don't say the wrong boy's name, Terry Yanish. Terry is Steve's brother, and Terry will be presenting the story of his dad, Jerry Yanish.
Well, it's pretty bittersweet, and it's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces. So thank you all for coming. I can't read from anything. I can only tell you what my research has led me to find out through these last couple of years. The internet was not really in existence when my father died, so I have a feeling I probably know more about what went on around him than what he actually knew. I think for the most part these guys lived in a bit of a bubble. But this kid was 3 months after turning 17, enlisted in the Marines. He needed his mother's signature to get into the Marines. And even after he got past that hurdle, the Marines didn't want him because he didn't meet the minimum weight requirement. I think he had to be 136 pounds. I'm guessing he was a fair amount shy of that. I still have his belt from that uniform, and it goes around one of my mini dachshunds, and that's about it. It's incredible when you think, from my generation, looking at the generation that we refer to as the greatest generation, and you can see how that moniker came to be. It seems very fitting to me. I think they were and are the greatest generation. It bothers me that Martin Schlenk was 20 feet across the road all my growing up years, and he had all of this experience, and I couldn't go over there and maybe have a cup of coffee with him and pick his brain, because we didn't know about any of this, because these guys didn't talk about any of this. And I don't know if they were ordered not to talk about it, or if it was just so ungodly awful that why would you come home and share that with your loved ones? Why would you put that in the heads of your wives, your girlfriends, or your kids? Would you, if you were Martin Schlenk, tell that story to your 5 little kids when you got home? Probably not. So I think the horror of what these men saw is why they were so quiet about it. My dad never said anything to me other than boot camp was beyond description horrible for him. He was a scrawny 17-year-old kid coming from a safe little town of Red Wing, Minnesota, never had been any place, and now he's in Cherry Point, North Carolina, under this grueling regiment and no mommy there to take care of him. It was tough. He said that many nights he went to bed pretty teary-eyed in boot camp. From boot camp, they sent him to San Diego to Marine Aviation School. He was going to be a gunner in Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. And the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber was the most popular plane used in the Pacific all through the war. It was a 2-man plane, the pilot facing forward, the radio gunner facing rear, and the plane held one 500 or 1,000 pound bomb under the main fuselage and a 250-pound bomb under each wing. 2 50 caliber machine guns facing forward. The pilot had control of all of that. The radio gunner had twin 30 caliber machine guns rear facing. And so these planes would travel at about 12,000 feet cruising speed. And they didn't need the Norton bomb sight or any other thing or radar. The pilot's eyes were the radar. The plane became the gun and the bombs became the bullet. These were extremely precision ways of fighting compared to level bombers, the B-17, the B-24s, the B-25s that were dropping bombs from 20 to 30,000 feet, and so many of them were for naught. These dive bombers took it down eyeball to eyeball. They would put the plane in a dive at 70 to 80 degrees at about 10,000 feet. They're coming almost straight down as fast as they can go. And I can only imagine sitting backwards in that position, what that must have been like. And at 500 feet, the pilot would release the wing bombs and then the main fuselage bomb. And just at treetop level, he would pull it back up, and they would try to get away, and the rear gunner's job was to protect the flank. And so that was Dad's job, radio gunner. He trained on Bougainville in the Solomons as far as close ground support. And then he was sent on to Luzon, the largest island in the northern part of the Philippines. The very first thing that MacArthur wanted done when the Allies had taken over Luzon was to get to Manila, because the Japanese had made everybody POWs. They had 3,700 people, both Americans and British, mostly businessmen, who had been living in Manila. And the Japanese had taken them hostage at the Santo Tomas University in the northern sector of the capital city of Manila. These people were almost dead. They'd been held for 36 months by the Japanese under terrible conditions, and they were ready to be dead. The Japanese had a standing order to shoot and kill every POW upon the Allies coming to rescue them. MacArthur put together the first cavalry that left Mingalden on the island of Luzon to travel 100 miles south to Manila as fast as humanly possible. There were 900 troops on the ground of both Army and Marines. There was 48 tanks. There was 168 dive bombers. It took them 3 days of fighting to get from Mingalden on the north part of the island to Manila to Santo Tomas University and free those captives, and they did. They did lose some, but by and large they were saved. At that time, just on the island of Luzon alone, there was 255,000 Japanese soldiers just on the island of Luzon. So that's what he did. They provided close ground support for the infantry on the ground. And at that time, even though the Americans had been in the Philippines for 50 years before World War II, the islands themselves had never been mapped. And so finding your way around on these islands was terribly hard because there was no identifiers. And so it was very tough. A lot of times, a pilot from a squadron would be on the ground with a patrol jeep, riding and driving and scouting out targets. And the pilot on the ground in the jeep would radio to the incoming dive bombers as to how to approach this target and guide them in. The other ways they did it was the lead dive bomber would drop a white phosphorus on the target without dropping his bombs, and then he would leave, and one by one they'd come in and hit that target, and then the lead bomber would come back and hit it. So he spent 3 or 4 months on the island of Luzon and the capturing of the city of Manila and the island of Corregidor, which sits in the mouth of Manila Bay, heavily armed by the Japanese, had to be taken out first. One of his squadron, both pilot and radio gunner, were lost in that battle over Corregidor. And after Luzon was safely secured, they moved south to the major island of Mindanao. And the same thing there. His squadron had received a couple commendations for a close air ground support, sometimes as little as 200 feet or 200 yards between the enemy and our infantry. and these dive bombers would come down and clean up the area so that the infantry could go forward. So when I look at this picture and think about playing baseball down in Red Wing one day and a year later being in that hell, it's hard to imagine. So good job, kid. I salute you. And that's all I can say.
Thank you, Terry. I would like to ask right now, and I forgot a minute ago, but does anybody have any particular questions for either Steve or Terry on what they heard about Martin Schlenk's story or Jerry Yanish's story? Okay. Thank you. Next we have Fritz Coulter, who is the son of Gene and Clarice Coulter. And Gene was in the Army pretty much the same time as Jerry Yanish served. Oh, no, Martin Schlenk served. Sorry. And of course, we all, if you don't know Gene Coulter in any other way, you know that he was our town mayor. And the city of Chanhassen would not be what it is today without Gene Coulter having been mayor. And I would honor Gene Coulter for that, if nothing else. But Fritz, if you would like to come and tell us a little bit about your dad's story.
First, I want to get one thing straight. We lived next door to Martin Schlenk before the Yanishes did. And believe me, Mark was no angel. And we knew Martin by a different name, Bull in the Woods. I have no idea how he got that nickname, but I think everybody around there knew him as Bull in the Woods. So if anybody knows how he got that, I'd be interested. I'll talk about my dad here a little bit and some interesting relationships that occurred during the war. My dad was inducted in the Army in 1941, and he went to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, is where he spent his time as far as for his basic training. He was assigned to the 68th Infantry Brigade at that time, and in January of 1942, he was shipped over to Ireland. They didn't tell him where he was going. He had to report to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and get on board a boat, and he had no idea where he was going. He ended up over in Ireland. And he didn't know my dad. I have the same affliction. It's called motion sickness. So if you're on a ship, you know exactly what you're doing. And that's what he did all the way over to Ireland. He was an officer, so he had a nice cabin to throw up in. He wasn't an officer at that time, I should say. Anyway, he got over there, and he was in Ireland for a very short period of time. He came home from Ireland in September. He went to Ireland in February and returned in September of 42. I think what happened at this time was the Battle of Britain was going on, and the Germans were going to attack England across the English Channel. But when the Battle of Britain basically defeated that, they started shipping some of the soldiers that were sent over to Ireland, as this was going to be like, these people were going to be thrown at the last minute if Germany decided to attack England. And so these soldiers were now shipped back to the United States. So on his way back, of course, he's on board a ship again, and make things even worse, the ship sunk. So they had to transfer everybody on the ship that he was on to a different troop transport. While he was in Ireland, he had bought many things for his future wife, my mother, which all went down with the ship. He had all these nice Irish linens and everything that he purchased, so they're all at the bottom of the ocean right now. When he got back home, my mother was up at Merrifield, Minnesota, She was up there on a girls' weekend with some of the girls from town. She got called up there. My dad called her up, and my mother said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I came home to get married." Well, she came back home, and of course, because of a short period of time and everything, they had to go down to the archdiocese and get all sorts of permissions because they couldn't do all the things that you have to do when you're Catholic to get married. And so they got all this stuff bypassed so that she got married. That's a picture of Mom and Dad. She's a pretty looking woman. And you can see where I get my tremendous good looks from. After they were married, he left to go to Officers Candidate School at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And he spent out there until December of 1942, where he was became a second lieutenant in the Signal Corps. He left Fort Monmouth on April of '43, and he shipped out to California. He was out of Pittsburgh, California, where he left for Hawaii in April of '43. He spent about a year on the island of Hawaii, or on the islands of Hawaii, and basically what he did there was, part of his Signal Corps duties was to create communication lines. So they were establishing a lot of communication lines on the islands themselves when they were on Hawaii. He was assigned to the 443rd Signal Battalion Construction. He was Company A. His company consisted of a captain, 2 lieutenants, and 50 enlisted men, of which 7 were non-commissioned officers. His first duty, or I should say the first battle that he was involved in, was the Battle of Niwotaka Atoll. This was in the Marshall Islands, and this occurred in March of 1944. Now this is where it gets really interesting. There was a task force that was involved, of course, that supplied support for all the soldiers that were going on board. And in this task force was this little bitty aircraft carrier called the USS Bunker Hill. So it's really interesting how, I'm pretty sure my dad knew Martin Schlenk because he was dating my mother, who lived right across the street from Martin. So it's really interesting that here he was on this island, and the support for the fighting that was going on that was being provided by one of the ships of the USS Bunker Hill. And those are the types of things that I found interesting as going through. Now, I don't have a lot of what he did on this particular, on the Niwotaka Atoll. I just know that he was involved with the battle for Engebe Island. And this is a very small island. The total square mileage was just a couple square miles. It took a total of 6 hours for the battle. They started at 8 o'clock in the morning. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the island was taken. This particular island was used by the Japanese as a refueling for their aircraft, so it became an important thing for the United States to take that little island. Now, the Niwotaka Atoll was 50 miles in diameter, I should say in circumference. So it was about the size of Lake Mille Lacs. And it was dotted with like 40 islands all around the outside. Only 3 of them were big enough to do anything. While he was there, he was involved with, again, establishing communication lines. They installed submarine cables between the islands so that they could have communication between the islands. Just to give you an idea, on this particular island, casualties, and you'll notice something as I go through this. The casualties for the U.S. were 313 killed, 77 missing, 879 wounded. The Japanese was 3,380 were killed, 105 were captured. The Japanese did not want to get taken alive. They committed suicide. This was ingrained into them. And as we go through these different battles, you'll see how bad it got. So after that particular encounter, he was involved, and and the next thing he was involved in, this was on the Marshall Islands. Next was the occupation of Tinian. And if everyone remembers this, Tinian was the island where the Enola Gay took off from. Now, the Battle for Tinian took place in September of 1944. And the island was occupied until 1945. Now on Tinian was a slightly larger island. It was 39 square miles, so you can think about the size of Manhattan Island, something about that size. Now, this was part of the Marianas Islands. This became an important part for the United States because Tinian was a basically flat island. After it was taken over and the Seabees came in to do the construction, they constructed 8 different airfields on this island. It was the largest airfield at the time in the world for all the B-29s that were coming into that area. Now, just to show you again the things that are occurring here, I want to step back for 1 second, back to the Niwottak Atoll. This is after the war. In 1952, the United States dropped an H-bomb on the Niwottak Atoll and basically obliterated one of the islands on the atoll. This is part of the tests that were going on in the Pacific at that time with atomic bombs. You probably remember Bikini was another one. Niwottak Atoll was another place where they were doing this. But back to Tinian now.
Can you turn it up? It's really hard to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. On Tinian, the casualties increased considerably. In the United States, it was 326 killed, 1,593 wounded. On the Japanese side, 5,542 were killed, 252 captured, 2,265 were missing. And also, 4,000 civilians died on this particular battle. This was a part of the Marianas Islands. This is part of the whole plan by General MacArthur to just skip from island to island. He wasn't involved in taking every individual island. He basically would skip from one group of islands to the next group of islands, cutting off the supply lines with the Japanese, and basically, as he referred to it, let them wither on the vine. They're not going to have anything, food, water, supplies, or anything. And so that's the approach that he took on it. So after Tinian, the next one that he was involved with was the occupation of Okinawa, which was part of the Ryukyus Islands, and that occurred on 4/26 of 1945. This battle lasted 82 days. This was even a more bloody encounter than Iwo Jima, the Battle of Okinawa. I should have mentioned also, there was this USS Bunker Hill showed up at Tinian for some strange reason as part of the task force. So it seems like every time my dad was involved in something, Martin Schlenk and his group were out there protecting him. And the same thing in Okinawa. The task force in Okinawa included the USS Bunker Hill. But anyway, Okinawa, the number of casualties was just unbelievable. It was 82 days of constant fighting, constant shelling. It never stopped. It was 24/7. Like I said, this is probably the bloodiest conflict in all of the Pacific. And I think this is one of the things that convinced President Truman to drop the atomic bomb, because this island was not part of, it was part of the Japanese homeland. It was considered part of their Japanese homeland. And when you saw the things that they were doing on Okinawa, with having 15-year-old boys being on the front lines as soldiers, and the number of casualties amongst these kids is just amazing. They had absolutely no training. They were put in the front lines to try to defeat the Americans as they were landing. The constant bombardment by artillery resulted in an extremely high number of soldiers suffering from PTSD, what we refer to as PTSD now, at that time was called combat fatigue. And just to give you an idea of how bad this was, between April 1st and June 22nd, there were 7 major kamikaze attacks occurred on the island and in the task force that was supporting them, with up to 1,500 planes at a time. Now, on the particular 2 kamikazes that hit the USS Bunker Hill, because this was there was so much between the Bunker Hill and what was going on with my dad, I did a lot of research into Bunker Hill also. But the 2 kamikaze planes had 500-pound bombs. The first kamikaze plane dropped its bomb. It went through the hull and out the other side of the ship and exploded in the ocean. And the second plane crashed into the main part of the superstructure of the Bunker Hill, and its bomb exploded on board. Part of the reason that the Bunker Hill, I should say, the United States aircraft carriers were more prone to fire than like the British aircraft carriers was because the decks on the aircraft carriers in the United States were wood, and on the British they were steel. So that made a big difference. Now, some interesting things about this during this time period, this 82 days. On May 8th of that year, victory was declared in Europe while we were still fighting on Okinawa. 3 days later, the Bunker Hill was hit. So the war in Europe was over with, and people, so much has been on the war in Europe, and so little is known about what happened in the Pacific, and the relationship between what was going on in Europe and what was also going on in the Pacific. But on Okinawa, the final involvement with my father, and casualties, U.S. dead, 20,195. Wounded, 55,162. 26,000 soldiers suffered from combat fatigue. 26,000. Japanese casualties. Now, this is only an estimate. This included civilians and soldiers. 110,000. 7,000 were captured. And the estimate was at least 40,000 of those casualties were probably civilians. While my dad was on the island, he wasn't involved so much in combat as he was in establishing communications. And Nancy's got a couple of pictures here of the types of conditions that they worked under. These are the types of things where they had to run the communication lines through. Dad, like Martin and Jerry, didn't say anything. The only thing I ever got from him was one time he said that their worst fear was 2 things. Japanese were left behind as snipers when you're out in the telephone pole running wire, and the diseases in the jungles. And the conditions they had to work in, there was an awful lot of disease. He had I have a copy of his vaccinations. I've never had as many vaccinations in my lifetime as he had when he was going through the service. It's just unbelievable. Dad finished his service in Okinawa and was transported back to the United States, mustered out at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. And like everybody, came back, got a job, went to work to create this great country. Sorry, I'm just proud of you. And Mark, Dad received 3 battle stars. Again, this junky little aircraft carrier called USS Bunker Hill received 11 battle stars. They were involved in 11 conflicts in the Pacific. The Bunker Hill was put to sea in 1943, in April of 1943, and in May of 1945 was taken out of action. So in that 13-month period of time, it was involved in 11 different battles. So that's all I have. Thank you.